Our next speaker is Dr. Mallarika Sinha, Assistant Professor, Center for Women's Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Her topic is Inside Out, Women's Movement and Women in Movements. The lecture is of 1 hour, 45 to 50 minutes presentation by the respected speaker, followed by a 10 to 15 minutes interactive session. Now, I warmly welcome Dr. Mallarika Sinha to deliver her talk.
Right. If possible, may I request some of you at least to put your cameras on? Because it's absolutely difficult, to speak to, kind of 30 squares on your screen. So if it is possible, would it be, if you can? Is it possible for anyone to put your, okay, it seems it's not. So is there any chance that if any of the organizers are around to ask whether you have been able to read the paper which I shared, or is it something different? Have you read it, or has it been shared with you, or is it something I need to go through it? Right. Okay.
Nothing like that. It has not been shared, I think.
Right. Not yet shared with us.
Right. Okay. Because I did not know whether it will be shared previously or not. Maybe later on, perhaps. So the title of my topic is Women in Movements and Women's Movements. And I guess I would rather begin with the difference between women in movements and women's movement. And though the format says that I would speak for 45 minutes straight and then there would be 15 minutes of interaction. But, at least personally, what I would like is to make it as interactive as possible while I'm speaking, because it's really very difficult to continue speaking, to kind of listen to one's own voice continuously for 45 minutes, right? So it's rather difficult. So if I may invite my colleagues who are present here to help me out with the difference between these two ideas. What would you consider is the difference between women in movements and women's movements?
May I try, ma'am?
Sure, of course.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Paila, and I'm a research aspirant in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies under the Department of English Literature. However, my answer would be that if we talk about women in movement, that would mean that the movement can be about anything. It about a racial concern or a gender concern or a political concern, but it means that women would be also a part of it as a member of society. And women's movement would mean that the movement is all about the women, and the women consolidation is the main focus of that movement. The women are consolidated, and they are put together to make a statement or make their essential role visible or evident.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Pai. Yes, Sonia. And if I may request all of you, just call me Mallarika. It's okay. It's my name, and it's okay. All right, call me Mallarika. Yes, Sonia.
Good afternoon, ma'am. First of all, I think the two parts that that your paper is focusing on, that is women's movement and women in movement. I would like to view it as, and do correct me if I'm wrong, women's movement can be anything which is concerned about women's issues with probably a second-hand experience, if it is not voicing women through the voices of women. And women in movement, I would like to read it from a feminist stance as, which is a lived-in experience of women being voiced by women themselves through mobilization. So this would be my understanding, very, very in a nutshell. And please do correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you, ma'am.
No, not at all. I mean, in the sense that you have a very interesting, very interesting interpretation of the ways in which, though, we may chat later on when you say that, the difference between second-hand experience and lived-in experience, we may have a different conversation on that later on. Yes, of course, if that's possible. Anyone else would like to think about, take us through your thoughts on the difference between women in movements and women's movement? Right. So actually, taking on from both what Payal and Sonia have argued, I would say definitely that is the point to start a conceptual distinction between women in movements and women's movements. But then if I go by Payal's definition, that women's movement is a movement concentrated on the issues of women, voiced by women, taking from Sonia's argument. Whereas women in movements is a movement about something else in which women are also participating. Now then the question becomes, what is women's issue? Rather, what are women's issues and what are not women's issues? Right? That becomes one of the cornerstones of arguing or thinking through the ways in which women become participant in mobilizations. So, if I may, is it possible to share screen with you and show you a few slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely.
Right, great. So give me a couple of seconds and I'll put that on. Everyone can see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, where I would rather like to begin with, to make the rather slippery distinction between women's movement and women in movements understandable from a conceptual point of view, is first to clarify what a social movement is. Social movements are collective mobilizations of people in pursuit of change, and frequently they follow extra-institutional methods to transform negative consequences of authoritarianism and development policies. So then we need to find out, when we are talking about either women in movements or women's movement, what is the movement, where is the movement, where is it possible to grasp something and identify and label it, that here it is, this is the movement, this is what I call a movement. So Quoting from Robert Young, I think it is important for us to keep in mind that what constitutes a movement is an array of heterogeneous activities like ideological consolidation, defining the modes of becoming an activist, mobilizing, none of which is the movement in itself, but at the same time making up a surface of their meaning effect, a simulacrum that brings the event or the movement into being. So these are the constituent parts of becoming a movement. The ideological consolidation, defining modes of becoming an activist, mobilizing in the sense that how does one kind of go around the people, telling them about the goals of the movement, and then bring them together into the kind of activism they want the people to do. And often a movement kind of emotionally becomes divided between us and them, us who are inside the movement and them who are not inside the movement. Then there are, of course, also friends of the movement who are part of the us, and then there is the enemy of the movement who are trying to stop the movement. So there are several different paths by which a movement comes into being. And then when they all come together, at that point of time, they create a meaning effect when a movement doesn't remain only a summation of the parts of the whole. They become something else, something more than the constituent parts. They start to have a different kind of life. Okay? So far, everybody is with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Great. Now, is it visible again?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. So, when we are trying to understand women in movements, so there are certain questions we need to ask ourselves. That what were or are the women doing? What they think they were or are doing? What others think that women were or are doing, and how their stories are told. So if we are trying to understand women in movements, if we start trying to answer these questions, then probably we will start arriving at that critical point that would help us in understanding what are women's issues and what are not their issues. So if I, for example, think about something like a peasant movement, would we say that women are also part of a peasant movement? Or rather, would we try to think about the peasant, the idea of the peasant as a gendered subject? That a peasant can also be a woman. This is precisely where the challenge actually posed by this distinction is located. That we have become too used to conceptualizing certain ideas only in terms of the masculinized protagonist. That's why when we say something like a women's movement, then only it starts making sense that women also have issues for which there are mobilizations. Instead, if we start thinking in terms of what women are doing, what they are thinking they are doing, what others are thinking they are doing, and how their stories are told, then we can actually revisit the ideas which are prefix of the movements, like peasant movement or working class movement or Dalit movement or Black movement, ethnic movements, language movements, all kinds of movements. If we start thinking the protagonist of those movements, not in terms of a masculinized subject. A peasant, we are actually very kind of accustomed to think as a man, with a plowshare on his shoulders, in a particular kind of clothing, going out in the fields, right? But that's not untrue. Of course, that's an idea of a peasant. But that's not the whole idea of the peasant. A peasant is also the woman who works very hard on the field itself. Sowing, most of us are from Bengal, I guess. So whenever we have crossed during the monsoon on the train, on each side of the track, we would see hundreds of women hunched over in knee-deep water, sowing the paddy seedlings, right? Is that not peasant activity? Now, is she not a peasant woman? Or rather, is the peasant also not a woman? I would very emphatically say yes. So, can we then successfully argue that women also participate in the peasant movement? Or is it something which I think Sonia was saying, that this is also their lived-in experience as being a peasant? So when they go into the mobilization, they don't go only as women as support group. They go as activists, as peasants. This is where precisely the problem becomes when we come to the third question, which is what others think women were or are doing. Often, the way peasant movements are narrated, often when they are told, even in the most sensitive academic frameworks, it is often forgotten that women are also peasants, women are also working class, women are also Dalit, women are also kind of ethnic subjects, that underlining the woman part as a supportive element in all other movements, except for women's movement, is something we need to be very careful about whenever we are trying to make any distinction, especially when we are creating a particular pigeonhole called women's movement. So that's why my contention has always been that having a separate idea of women's movement is fine, but that should not overshadow the very idea that in all other movements, women are often equally participant. They are not the support category in which they are kind of the also ran. They are protagonists of those movements too. And these categories are often very overlapping. A peasant can be a working class person. The Dalit can be both a peasant and a working class person. An ethnic subject can be Dalit, peasant, and working class. So, if we remember that these categories are overlapping, then we should also keep in mind for women's movement and women in movements that women are also overlapping categories. And we should not forget, when we are thinking about women's issues, that peasants' issues are not women's issues, or working class issues are not women's issues, or Dalit issues are not women's issues. So, the conceptual distinction when we make between women in movements and women's movement, let us always be cautious about not creating airtight boundaries and keep our concepts pristine and clean and neat in such a way that we forget that they are very messily internally connected. To come to the next point, which is when we are trying to understand something called social movement, whether it's a women's movement or not, or rather whether we consider all movements as women's movement, within that perception of categorizing a movement, what do we need to study when we have to look into what is a movement, where is a movement, how do we study a movement, where do we see a movement? There are 3 points which I would argue that one needs to be aware of: the historical context, the theoretical context, and what I call a contemporary context can also be translated as the immediate context within which a movement sparked off. I guess many of us have read extensive news coverage on the very recent farmers' movement, right? Are you familiar with the farmers' movement in India in the last couple of years? Are you? Is there any response? That has anyone been familiar with what the farmers' movement was? Okay, so there is a response. Yes, right, of course. Many of you are familiar with that. That's great. So, if you remember that there were a great number of women present there, right? Of all ages. They are all farmers. And they had their issues. But to go back to the point that I was trying to make, that the immediate context, where we remember that the farmers' movement exists. There have been, the most spectacular event in the recent times was the kind of blockade that they did for almost 11 months, almost a year. But even before that, the agricultural crisis that the farmers are facing, they have protested in various different ways. And this was the farm laws became the immediate context within which this kind of blockade-based farmers movement fled, right? So that's what I call the immediate context. But then there is a longer historical context that we need to keep in mind. Then, of course, there is the theoretical or the ideological context and the immediate context. So, to give you an example, of the historical context, it may be always useful to have the larger historical context of post-colonial India in mind. You may focus on something very specific as a movement, but to contextualize, to situate that movement within the historical context, it is probably useful to remember how development and nationalism in the post-colonial world, especially within the Indian context, have interacted with each other. Just to give you a very, 5 minutes nutshell, is that development and nationalism in the post-colonial world would refer to the manners in which that after the imperial kind of imperialism ended, the British imperialism ended, and around the same time, the Dutch and the French and Spanish imperialism ended quite a few 100 years back, actually in early 19th century. But if we take the 1930s, 40s, 50s as the end of the imperialist era, European imperialist era, then we would see that with the emergence of the newly independent nation states, one of the key features of these newly independent nation states was their focus on development. Because the former colonies were exploited so much and denuded of their resources in such a way, poverty and all other kinds of issues related with poverty was so great in these former colonies that they had to make development one of their most important thrust areas. So far, so good. But then the idea of development and implementation of development took different routes in different contexts. For India, it actually focused largely on planned economy, and tried to have a protective regime of development to increase the standard of living for the country at a general level, and then have a very regulated trade relationships with the open market economy. So mostly it was, though it's called mixed economy, the focus on the protected market is something which we need to keep in mind, which also meant nationalism in the sense that the companies that produced the essential goods and services were of Indian origin. So there is a manner in which development and nationalism came together and became intertwined in the way post-colonial economy and post-colonial politics flourished, within which we need to, because my focus is on gender and especially women as the protagonist, we need to keep in mind how women fared in this interlacing between development and nationalism. That women in the 50s, 40s and 50s, they were mostly considered women to be developed, that women needed a greater guidance than men in facing development, and they need to be developed. But then from 1970s onwards, women kind of asserted that they are no less than men in terms of accepting policies, and that they require not any kind of protection in terms of the kind of safety of that kind, but rather they need to be treated equally as citizens, and they demand every safety that a citizen can demand. From the 1980s, what we often say that the second wave of women's autonomous movements began, especially with focus on the violence against women, right? And then from the 1990s came the fall of the second world, which is the fall of the socialist economic world in terms of Soviet Union, and then the open market regime began, within which women faced a different set of challenges as the working class, as the peasant, as Dalit, as ethnic subject. The theoretical context, what we need to keep in mind is, of course, this planning to globalization, from disruption to change. Basically, this concerns about the way a movement is perceived in social theories. most social theories, sociological, especially sociological theories of the 50s and the 60s, considered movement as disruption. That it kind of presumed that whatever is happening within the status quo is good for everybody. So anyone who is raising a voice saying that no, not everything is all right, we need to challenge the status quo, then it is treated as some kind of a call for a movement is treated as something like a disruption. Instead, from the 1960s came the thrust areas in social theory to consider the call for movement not as disruption, but as an idea of change. This altered the academic pursuit of movement as a theme of study. Especially, Charles, people like Charles Tilly and was at the forefront. Dov McAdam. Then there is Sidney Taro, who actually made that transition in the perception of social movement as from disruption to change. Now, given these two contexts, that how conceptually social movements were undergoing a change and what the historical context of India was, then how do we think about gendering social movement? And then also comes the moment we start thinking about movement not as disruption but as change, then we also confront, as Hannah Arendt argued on violence, the book on violence, that how do we interpret the role of political violence? That as long as we were considering it as disruption, then of course we were labeling violence as something really bad, which is unwanted. But then, if we are thinking movement in terms of change, which may be necessary, but only after something changes, then one can realize whether it is for good, for bad, or for ugly, then the approach towards understanding the role of violence in bringing change becomes far more complex than just branding it as bad or unwanted. And here, the question of gender becomes absolutely significant because women's issues, if we are considering drawing from the first point that I made, that women's issues concern safety a great deal, all women's issues, not only middle class, urban middle class women's issues, but all women's issues who are peasant, working class, and everything else. Violence against women has been one of the most important questions. There, of course, the tussle then becomes that if we consider violence against women as something which needs to change, and of course it needs to change, then what kind of status do we allot to even women who adopted violent methods to bring in change? And here, it immediately goes back to one of the kind of difficult eras of nationalist politics, the 1920s and 30s, when armed anti-colonial movements happened. And women participated in those movements. They led guerrilla attacks. They used arms to assassinate British officials. in that case, how do we place these two issues together? That the moment we are trying to understand the basic women's issue, it has to be violence against women, violence against all women. But then in that case, how do we justify the history? There is a history of women participating in armed movements, armed violence in movements. This, again, I would say is, for example, I would say is one of the interesting ways of reading women in movements and women's movement. How an issue becomes contestable, how an issue becomes interestingly complicated when we start linking women in movements with women's movements. And finally, for the contemporary context, women as part of the people, the power that includes gender and globalization through the lens of global resistance. These are the points one can think about that they're not really very difficult to imagine, and you can always think about it, and we can come back to it in the question answer session if you want it to be so. So conceptualizing social movements then needs to take into account certain aspects. One is difference between everyday resistance and movement activism. That the kind of everyday activities that one does, which often include resistance towards relations of power, are not exactly the same for a movement activism. Then there is the difference between a brief but strong movement and a long-drawn movement. So there can be different phases and episodes within a movement itself, that one movement can have a very appealing, strong 5 years, and then it may lie dormant for next 20 years, and then it can come back with again a strong moment of appeal 20 years later. So there is a way in which movements survive, the way in which movements live, and even they die too. So when we are thinking about gendered political activism, mobilizing women requires to be aware of 4 more points, as I would say. That the impossibility of the imagined community of women, that it is very difficult, even though Begum Rokeya wrote that wonderful novelette in 1905, Sultana's Dream, which is Lady Land, a community of women. But it's very difficult to imagine a nation with women, because gender is intersected by so many other categories that the idea of sisterhood, global sisterhood, doesn't really ring true anymore, because there are complexities of women's issues, and because gender involves not only the relationship between men and women, but also between women and between men and men. It's a network, it's a set of relationships of power that, kind of Dalit man's context of exploitation and an upper caste woman's context of exploitation may vary, but they are both kind of being exploited, so they may be able to form a connection amongst themselves to resist against patriarchy. So there are different kinds of complexities within women's issues which one needs to be aware of. And institutionalized politics and the politics of gender, which we all know that family perhaps is the first institution where politics and power plays very significant roles, but we do not consider them as politics, or rather, even when we do consider family, the politics in family, we tend to trivialize them. That family politics apparently is not so important as state politics, as party politics. But we often tend to make it a point that as if family politics within state politics is not so good. Then we need to figure it out why not so good. Then why don't we recognize the politics within family as important, and why don't we analyze politics within family as seriously as we do the same with a government or a state? And then there remains the global versus the local impasse. That what issues are global and what issues are local. Then, of course, I'm sure that's a completely rhetorical question. You understand, are women naturally more peaceful? Definitely not. So there's a gendered division of revolutionary violence, as well, as I was trying to argue in the slide before, that this complex relationship of violence against women, and violence against women takes so many different aspects, and women's participation in revolutionary violence or in political violence. How do we make it, that complex relationship work? And even there are studies which reflect that there is even a division of labor within the political violence itself. That in a guerrilla unit, a peasant woman makes food rather than carrying a gun. If all of you are aware that in 1932, when in Chittagong Armory raid, just before that, a smaller guerrilla unit attacked the Pahartoli European Club under the leadership of Pritilata Wadedar. She had to argue with Surya Sen quite a lot that women can lead armed revolutionary guerrilla attacks, that she can wield a gun, and that she can take the lead. So that has been a different kind of fight. Do we not recognize it? And how do we recognize it? They are engineers of economic development. I don't need to explain that, and making environment gendered. So finally, to come back to my point, that when we are thinking about women in movements and women's movement, is it just another category of women's movement? Or what is the, for that, is it just another category of movement? I would definitely say no. So then if we say no, then what do we do? Then we need to find out what is the move in women's movement. What are the issues? How they are mobilized? What are the concerns? Then probably the interaction between women in movements and women's movement would become clearer to us, and complex issues, we need to acknowledge them as complex. Gender is not easy. Women as a category is not easy. Women's movement is not easy. Let us recognize the complexities. Let us recognize how they are so intricately woven that often we miss them. And that's why it's important for us to acknowledge them, recognize them, and be aware of them whenever we are confronting them in our real lives. So I would say here, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mallarika Sinha, for your enriching and stimulating talk on women's movement and women's issues from various perspectives. I'm sure participants have many questions. I'm just requesting them to post their questions or comments or observation in the chat box immediately. Dear participants.
can I just ask the question rather than just typing, because it will take time?
Yes,
My
please.
question is more interactive, please.
Yes, please, please.
Ma'am, first of all, thank you for that intellectually enriching presentation. Just one question which I was intrigued with is when we talk about various kinds of movement, like for example, Dalit movement, peasant movement, we see that, you know, when women in movement particularly, do they have voices as much as women's movement? For example, I'll just give you an example. There was this article by Sharmila Rege that Dalit women talk differently. Or if I could say, you know, when the issue that Patricia Hill Collins also talks about, that, you know, when there's a black men's movement, where are the black women's voices? So I would just like to know your position or your take on that in this particular issue, that, you know, when there are women in a particular movement, for example, peasants movement, or you mentioned about farmers movement, then how are their issues as women addressed? Is it not different than women's movement per se?
Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. So is it something I would request the chair here, that should we take more than one questions, or I go along answering them and as questions come? So what do you think would be better?
Ma'am, we have 15 minutes. It's up to you. In whichever way you want, you can, you know,
Right. Okay. Thank you.
ma'am.
Okay, because I think Sonia's question is really important, so I'll start answering them, and please formulate your questions as we go along.
Thank you.
So yes, you're absolutely right, Sonia, that of course, you know, whenever a movement starts, it doesn't mean that patriarchy goes away. As I was kind of trying to give you the answer or example from the anti-colonial armed nationalist movements, right? That Surya Sen definitely needed to be persuaded by Prittilata to allow or kind of give her the command of that guerrilla attack. So there are, of course, there are issues of such patriarchal control within the movements itself, and the black movements or the Dalit movement. They are not different in this way. But the interesting part, and often what women's historians have done and feminist historians have done, is to seek out, and there are actually many women in such movements who actually have made huge contributions within the movement when it was happening. But then that is how my fourth question is always, that how are their stories told? How are they remembered? There are actually mechanisms of forgetting which outrightly downplay women's contribution during a movement in their later accounting of it. For example, if you know about the Tebhaga movement in 1944 to 46, and then again 49 to 50 in Bengal, yes. So yes. So in that Chipko movement, only as women in movement or both, I would definitely say, isn't nationalism a women's issue? I would say definitely yes. So that's why I would say that we may use both the terms, women in movements and women's movement, but we need to be always aware, depending on the question at hand, the question I'm trying to answer, that the overlapping and intersecting parts. So as I was answering Sonia's question, that in Tebhaga, peasant women made huge contributions. There are many names, from Poko Rauni to Bimala Majhi, to Kollani Dasgupta, and of course Mother Aholla of Chandanpuri. They made huge contributions, but their stories are not really told until the 1980s and 90s, when feminist historians started kind of digging up older histories. And of course, one could only, you talk about Tebhaga, and the only name you hear is Ila Mitro. And Ila Mitro is remembered. Why? Because she was hideously tortured. So a woman is remembered for her experience of torture, not for the leadership role that she played. So that is something which needs to change. And that is precisely where feminist historians and women's historians are making the change. Bring out the histories of women trade union leaders, bring out the histories of working class movements, where women played very significant roles and led. And so those are the histories. I hope they would end up in school textbooks one day, and our next generation would learn about those women. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yes. So you were talking about how women's stories are told. You were very interested in that. So it just reminded me of that feminist movement or the movements of women, where the history of the trajectory of movements of women are chronologized, and they are told in the in terms of waves, first wave, second wave, and third wave. But we see that somehow the waves are like continuum, and the first waves issues are continuous within the second waves, and there are certain issues, certain women's issues, as you say, which are space specific and time specific, which are culture specific. These things are not included or incorporated within the first wave or second wave or third wave. So I want to ask how far it is right or just to tell feminist movements trajectory as per the wave.
Sorry, one, I think somebody's mic is on and there's a background noise. So Payal, may I request you to kind of say your final part of your question once more, what you wanted to ask? Yes.
Yes. I want to ask that is it right or just to chronologize women's movement or trajectory of women's movement through waves? Because there are certain other stories.
See, well, there exists already a huge kind of academic work, huge body of academic work on the way the waves are considered. But if you ask me, I would say waves probably are far more important and interesting in the Euro-American context, not the post-colonial Indian context. Here, the waves are not really the ways in which the Euro-American context experienced it. And our ideas of feminist struggle, women's issues are very different than the white Euro-American idea of waves happened. So we would probably be better if we kind of, as I think Sonia was mentioning, that if we try to align with the Latina movement, with the Black women's movement, with the Hispanic women's movements, in South America, Australian Aborigine women's movements. So if we try to realign our networks of international connections in different way than we are kind of accustomed to in terms of what was happening in England and what was happening in North America, especially in terms of the white women, then probably we are better off. So there's my answer. Bye.
Yes, ma'am. I find it quite absurd that whenever feminist movement trajectory is told, the history of feminist movement is told, they are always chronologized and say it in terms of first wave, second wave, and third wave. But there are other stories also which needs to be told.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, another thing, can you please share your email ID with us? I need to talk to you about something.
Sure, of course I can. Yeah, I just type it out here.
Dear participants, any other questions or comments? Okay.
Ma'am, can I ask another question? Okay. My question is about care economy. Women are always seen as the nurturer of the family or the caregiver of the family, but caregiving as an act can sometimes be really a burden. And if the caregiving is shared by other members of people, then obviously that would not be considered as a burden. But sometimes, even in our present situation, also women are expected to avoid their personhood or selfhood or career, and pursue their elders caregiving. So I want to know what is your take on that. How do you think about care economy?
See, though I'm not an expert on care economy at all, and there are a large number of people who are and who are writing very interesting books, what I can say that there has to be a distinction between responsibility and sacrifice. That if a responsibility is being transferred into making a sacrifice, then it ceases to be a responsibility. It becomes something more than, as you were saying, that you have to forego your personhood, you have to forego your own considerations about yourself to take care of someone within the family. But I guess that's precisely where the professionalization itself is so much more important in understanding care economy. That care economy needs to take into account not the physical labor and the emotional labor of the family members, but also the professionalized setup that is emerging, and not to evaluate it in terms of a judgmental way that taking professional help in terms of caring for somebody within the house doesn't necessarily stop from being careful about their responsibilities. Yeah, just a moment, I have a call, if I can take it. Yes, sorry.
May I ask another question?
Dear Payal, I'm
Yes.
sorry to intervene.
Okay. No problem.
It's okay.
No problem. I'll mail her.
Thank you, Payal, for being so understanding. Thank you so much.
Okay. No.
Thank you once again, Dr. Sinha Roy, for your thought-provoking talk. Looking forward to hear you again in future. And dear participants, thank you so much for your enthusiastic involvements. For today, we end here.